The funeral of Richard Holloway was supposed to be an ordinary, quiet event. He had lived a long and respectable life, rich with achievements, accolades, and the love of his family. His widow, Margaret, stood stoically by the gravesite, her eyes red from weeping, but her posture unwavering. Their children, Ethan and Claire, tried to maintain their composure as their father's coffin was being lowered into the cold, freshly dug earth. The guests gathered around the grave, some friends, some distant relatives, all silently mourning the loss of a man who had been a pillar of the community. Samson, the Holloway's aging golden retriever, lay quietly by the widow's side, his head resting on his paws. The dog had been a part of the family for years, and even in his old age, he remained the silent companion to Richard's children and wife. His tail was motionless, his fur a little grayer than it once had been, but there was an unmistakable loyalty in his eyes. The funeral procession was supposed to be just another moment in time, one marked by sadness but ultimately mundane in its familiarity. The priest's voice filled the air, a soft, soothing murmur as he offered words of finality, words of closure. But then something shifted. A low growl interrupted the silence. Claire, Richard's daughter, turned in alarm. Samson had suddenly risen to his feet. His ears were perked, his body stiff with tension. He had never behaved this way before, certainly not at a family event as solemn as this. "Samson, stop it," Claire whispered, pulling at the dog's collar. But the golden retriever was undeterred. His growl deepened, his nose twitching with a sense of urgency. Then, before anyone could react, Samson lunged. "Samson!" "No!" Claire cried out as she tried to restrain him, but the dog was too strong. With an almost unnatural force, he bounded toward the casket. There was a gasp from the crowd. The pallbearers were thrown into disarray, and one of them almost lost their footing. Samson was now barking ferociously, his claws scrabbling against the smooth wood of the coffin. His eyes were wild, focused entirely on the sealed lid as though he was trying to get to something hidden inside. "Get him away from there!" Margaret screamed, her voice strained with panic. But Samson was relentless. His body twisted and thrashed as if something inside the coffin was calling to him. And then, with an earth-shattering crack, one of the coffin's edges gave way. The lid buckled under the force of Samson's frenzied claws. The crowd collectively gasped, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The coffin wobbled and shifted as if fighting against gravity. The pallbearers scrambled back, their faces white with shock. Samson's frantic barking filled the air, growing more frantic, more desperate. Finally, the lid tilted, and with a hollow thud, it fell open. The sight that met everyone's eyes was nothing short of horrific. The body inside wasn't Richard Holloway's. It was a stranger. The crowd recoiled, horrified murmurs spreading through the assembled mourners. Richard's daughter, Claire, staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth in disbelief. Margaret, her face drained of color, let out a piercing scream, one filled with terror and confusion. The funeral director rushed forward, his face pale, his voice trembling as he stammered, This is impossible." Samson barked once more, his gaze locked on the strange body, as though he could sense that something was deeply wrong. The dog wasn't just agitated, he was resolute, almost as though he had been trying to prevent this moment from happening all along. "Where is my father?" Ethan, Richard's son, demanded in a voice that cracked. He took a step forward, eyes wild with panic, his mind racing for answers. He knew his father had died. It wasn't possible that someone else was lying in that coffin. Was it a mistake? Had they mistakenly swapped the bodies? But the confusion and terror in his heart told him it was something much more than a mistake. The coffin was tipped onto its side, its once pristine surface marred by Samson's relentless efforts to claw through it. The body inside, pale and lifeless, belonged to a man that no one recognized, a man with a face that was both unfamiliar and unsettling. This wasn't a simple mistake. Someone had orchestrated this. A voice broke through the chaos, a voice filled with disbelief and despair. "Where is my father?" Ethan repeated, now demanding answers from the funeral director, who stood frozen in place. The funeral director muttered under his breath, looking at Samson with confusion and fear. I don't know what happened," he stammered. I followed the instructions given to me." His words were hollow, and it was clear he had no idea how or why the wrong man was in the coffin. The police were called. The funeral was promptly halted. The mourners were dismissed, and a detective was called in to investigate the strange turn of events. Samson, having caused the coffin to open, was now more than just an innocent bystander. He had unwittingly become the key to a mystery that none of them could have anticipated. As the police arrived and began their investigation, it was clear that this wasn't just an ordinary case of mistaken identity. Something much more sinister was at play. And as Samson watched the scene unfold before him, it was as if he already knew. He had been there when the truth began to crack open. He had sensed something was wrong long before the coffin split open. And now he was waiting for the investigation to unfold, for the answers to come to light. But Samson knew one thing. Richard Holloway wasn't dead. And somewhere in the shadows, someone had staged his death. To be continued. The cemetery was now buzzing with the arrival of law enforcement. Officers moved like shadows among the mourners, their voices low and clipped as they began to cordon off the area. Samson, who had been pacing nervously around the open grave, stood still for a moment. His eyes never left the scene. He wasn't just a witness, he was the one who had set everything into motion. Detective Clara Dempsey arrived with her team. A seasoned investigator with a no-nonsense approach, Clara surveyed the scene carefully. She was a woman of few words, but when she spoke, everyone listened. She moved swiftly, her sharp eyes scanning every detail. She had seen many strange cases in her years of service, but this one felt different. This one felt dangerous. "Start with the family," she said to her officers, her voice steady. "Find out what they know." Who was Richard Holloway, really? Ethan and Claire were sitting on the steps of the chapel, stunned and silent. Margaret, still in shock, sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at the strange body in the coffin. The pallbearers were nowhere to be seen, now questioned and separated for interviews. The funeral director had been taken aside by another officer for questioning, his face pale with fear. Clara walked up to the family, her eyes fixed on them with a quiet intensity. "I know this is difficult, but I need answers," she said. "Where did your father, your husband, die?" Ethan's hands trembled as he clasped them together. "In his home 2 days ago. It was unexpected. He was healthy. A heart attack, we thought. He was supposed to be buried here today." Claire, her voice barely above a whisper, added, We didn't even get a chance to see him after. The funeral home said they took care of everything." Clara's brow furrowed. "Did your father have any enemies? Any threats?" Margaret looked up sharply, her eyes still glazed from shock. "No, not that I know of. Richard was a quiet man. He was an accountant. He didn't deal with shady people." But Clara wasn't so sure. There was something more to this story, something that hadn't been told yet. Just then, Samson barked loudly, breaking the silence. His stance was firm, his tail stiff. He was pointing toward the grave where the coffin had been dropped. It was as if he was trying to say something. Something no one else could understand. Clara turned and followed the dog's gaze. Samson, despite his age, seemed determined, like a bloodhound on a trail. She kneeled down beside him, trying to make sense of the dog's unusual behavior. The ground around the coffin had been disturbed. Someone, perhaps the person who had swapped the bodies, had made sure the casket was positioned awkwardly. The angle of the lid suggested that it had been tampered with, moved or shifted to hide something. Her instincts told her there was more than just a body swap. Richard Holloway's death had been staged, but why? And who stood to gain from such a deception? As Clara stood up, she noticed the strange man in the coffin once again. John Elrich. The name rang a bell. She'd seen it on the news before, a convicted fraudster who had supposedly died while serving time. The details of his death had been murky, and now it seemed someone had used his name to cover up something much darker. "Take a look at this," one of the officers called out. Clara followed him to the side of the grave, where they'd unearthed a small, hidden compartment beneath the coffin. It had been buried beneath the soil, likely meant to remain undetected. Inside the compartment was a folder, its edges worn. Clara opened it, her eyes scanning the contents quickly. Inside were several documents, each stamped with official-looking seals, death certificates, medical records, and one very peculiar form, a government contract. Her heart began to race as she read the name at the top of the document, Richard Holloway. The file detailed a top-secret mission, but there was nothing more than cryptic language and classified information. No clear explanation of what had actually happened. Just a series of initials and codes that, for a civilian, were meaningless. "What is this?" Clara murmured under her breath. Ethan, standing nearby, noticed her looking at the folder. His face twisted in confusion. "What are you reading?" "Is it about my father?" Clara handed him the papers without saying a word. He scanned them quickly, his face paling with each line. This isn't my father's handwriting. These aren't his records." Then it hit Clara. Richard Holloway hadn't just been an accountant. He had been something far more secretive, something far more dangerous. And someone powerful, had gone to great lengths to erase him from existence. Clara's mind was working quickly now. This was no longer a simple case of mistaken identity. Richard Holloway had faked his death, and his family, his wife and children, had been kept in the dark. But why? Was he trying to escape someone, or was he part of something much bigger? Samson barked again, interrupting her thoughts. He was still fixated on the grave, as if urging them to dig deeper. "Come on, let's get these documents back to the station," Clara said, her voice steady but her mind racing. "There's much more to this than we thought." But as she and the officers began to walk away, she caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. A shadow, just a flicker, moving among the trees. Someone was watching, and Clara knew, deep down, that this investigation was just the beginning. There was a dangerous game being played here, one that involved not just Richard Holloway, but perhaps even the people closest to him. And Samson, he was more than just a dog. He was a partner, someone who could sense what others couldn't, someone who knew more than anyone realized. The mystery of Richard Holloway's death had just begun, and Clara was determined to get to the bottom of it. As Detective Clara Dempsey sat at her cluttered desk at the precinct, the folder containing Richard Holloway's mysterious documents lay open before her. She scanned the papers, but the more she read, the more questions arose. The documents were marked top secret and contained strange codes, but it was the mention of a Blackbird operation that caught her attention. She had never heard of it before, and there was no indication of what it entailed. Samson sat quietly by her feet, his golden fur slightly matted from the long day. The dog had been more than an observer so far. He had been the catalyst for uncovering this web of deception. Clara sighed, rubbing her temples as the pieces of the puzzle refused to fit together. Richard Holloway hadn't just been a regular man. He had been involved in something far more dangerous. And from the way the documents were hidden, it seemed someone wanted to make sure his secret would remain buried. But why go so far as to fake his death? "Samson," Clara murmured, her voice soft but filled with determination. The dog's head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging her. "We're going to find out what happened to Richard Holloway. Whatever it takes." The phone on her desk rang, pulling Clara from her thoughts. She picked it up immediately, her eyes narrowing as the voice on the other end introduced themselves as Agent Turner, a federal officer from a government agency she hadn't heard of before. "Detective Dempsey?" The voice crackled through the phone. "I'm afraid you've stumbled upon something bigger than you realize." Clara stiffened, instinctively reaching for her pen. "What do you mean?" "There's a reason Richard Holloway's death was faked," Agent Turner continued, his voice now low and urgent. "And it's tied to national security." The words felt like a blow. Clara glanced down at Samson, who was staring at her with those perceptive amber eyes. He seemed to understand the gravity of the situation more than anyone else. "I need you to stop investigating this, detective." Turner's voice now took on an almost threatening tone. "Let this go. For your own safety." Clara set the phone down with a sharp click. She wasn't one to back down. Not now. Not when there were too many unanswered questions. Later that evening, Clara met with Ethan and Claire at a local diner. They had agreed to meet after the initial shock of their father's strange funeral had subsided somewhat. The widow Margaret had stayed home, overwhelmed with grief, but Ethan and Claire insisted they needed answers. Clara had come with one goal in mind, to speak with the family directly. Something wasn't adding up, and their emotions might help her understand what was hidden behind Richard's carefully constructed life. Claire stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, her face pale from the day's events. Ethan, on the other hand, was visibly agitated, fidgeting with a napkin on his lap. The anger in his eyes was unmistakable. They both had been lied to, and the man they called their father was now a stranger to them. "I can't believe it," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "All these years, I thought I knew him. But now I don't know who he was. What was he involved in?" Claire's lips trembled as she spoke softly. "I don't understand." He was just an accountant. Why would anyone want to fake his death? Why would anyone want to kill him? Clara could see the confusion and hurt in their eyes. The pain of losing a parent was universal, but this was something far worse. They had lost their father, not to death, but to an unseen hand. Your father wasn't just an accountant, Clara said carefully, leaning in slightly. He was involved in something far more dangerous than you realize. I found evidence, documents that suggest he was a part of a covert operation. Ethan's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. A covert operation? My dad? No, he wasn't a spy or anything. Clara's gaze softened. I know this is hard to understand, but there are things about your father's life that were hidden even from you. Something big happened. Something he tried to escape. Claire shook her head slowly. Were you saying that he wasn't just an accountant? That he lied to us? I think he was forced into something, Clara said. I don't know all the details yet, but I'm trying to find out. Your father's death wasn't an accident. It was part of a cover-up. The silence that followed was heavy. Ethan clenched his fists tightly, his jaw set. I need to know everything. All of it. I can't just pretend this isn't happening. Clara nodded. I'm going to need your help. If there's anything at all that you remember about your father's life that seemed unusual, now is the time to tell me. Claire looked at Ethan, who hesitated, then nodded. There's one thing, but it's strange. My dad always kept this old watch. It was a gift from someone he never spoke about. He said it was from a friend, but I never knew who. Clara's eyes lit up. The watch? Did he ever mention it to you? Was it something important? I don't think so. He kept it in a drawer, and when he died, he didn't want anyone to touch it. But we found it, hidden in his things. Clara stood up abruptly. I need to see that watch. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Richard Holloway hadn't just disappeared. He had been hiding something. A message, perhaps, or a clue that only his family could uncover. Samson stood up beside her, sensing her urgency. The dog had been with Clara every step of the way, a quiet yet determined companion. She looked down at him, and he met her gaze. He understood as well as she did that they were getting closer to the truth. The search for Richard Holloway's real story was far from over. And now it seemed the dog was more than just an observer. Samson was her partner in this mystery. His instincts were sharper than most, and together, they would get to the bottom of it. But as Clara left the diner, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. The danger was closing in, and with every step, the walls seemed to close in just a little more. The night was thick with tension as Detective Clara Dempsey drove back to her apartment. Samson curled up in the passenger seat. The case had taken an unexpected turn, and she felt the weight of it on her shoulders. The clock ticked by slowly, almost as if time itself was mocking her efforts. By the time Clara arrived at her apartment, it was nearly midnight. She unlocked the door and entered, but her mind wasn't on the quiet comforts of home. It was on that watch, Richard Holloway's hidden memento, the only link to the mystery that had yet to be unraveled. Samson padded quietly behind her, his golden fur glowing faintly under the soft kitchen light. Clara removed the watch from her bag and placed it on the kitchen table. The faint markings on the back of the silver case caught her eye. The watch was elegant, vintage even, something that didn't quite fit the ordinary life Richard Holloway had led. The numbers on the face were scratched, worn from use, and the hands were slightly askew. But it was the engraving on the back that intrigued Clara most. Blackbird, Agent A, May 4th, 98. She read it aloud, her voice low, as if she were speaking to herself. Samson stood nearby, his eyes never leaving her. There was something about the dog's intense gaze that unsettled her, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Samson seemed to know that this was more than just a simple clue. It was the key to unlocking everything. Blackbird, Clara whispered, the word repeating in her mind. It wasn't a name. It was a code, something meant to stay hidden. Clara pulled out the document she'd found earlier, Richard's secret files. She hadn't been able to make much sense of them yet, but now with the watch in front of her, it was like a light had gone off. Blackbird. She had to dig deeper. She set the watch aside, turned on her laptop, and began searching for any reference to Blackbird. She sifted through databases, looking for names, codes, or files that might tie into this mysterious operation. Hours passed, the screen before her filled with dead ends. No immediate leads. Samson, lying by her side, gave a low growl. It was a strange, subtle sound, a warning, almost. Clara paused, feeling a chill down her spine. She turned to look at him, but the dog's eyes were now fixed on the open window across the room, his body tense. Then she heard it, the creak of a door. Her heart raced. Samson sprang up immediately, running to the door and standing alert, his body bristling with energy. Clara's hand instinctively went to her sidearm, cold sweat beading on her forehead. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew something wasn't right. Cautiously, she approached the door, but when she looked through the peephole, her breath caught. No one was there. The hallway was empty. She stepped back, trying to regain her composure. Something was off, but she couldn't quite explain it. Her instincts screamed that the danger was near, but there was nothing physical to point to. She shook her head, telling herself it was just nerves. After all, she'd been working nonstop for the past few days. But Samson's behavior didn't lie. He was more than just a dog. He was a partner, an alert, sharp companion who could sense things she couldn't. Clara walked back to the table and grabbed the watch. Something wasn't adding up. Richard's life was clearly not what it seemed. The engraving on the watch was a crucial clue, and yet it only raised more questions. Agent A? What was the significance of the date? And why had a watch like this? She had to find out what Blackbird meant. What did Richard Holloway do to warrant the faking of his death? The next morning, Clara made a decision. She would go back to the cemetery. Meanwhile, Ethan and Claire had made plans to meet Clara at the cemetery too. The morning sun cast a pale light over the graves, and the air was cool as they approached the place where their father had been laid to rest, or so they thought. The trio stood together by the grave, all of them holding on to their own doubts, their own unresolved grief. "Do you really think there's something more to this?" Ethan asked, his voice harsh but tinged with desperation. Clara glanced at the fresh plot of earth where Richard Holloway's coffin had been lowered just days ago. "I know there's more," she replied. "I think your father was involved in something dangerous. And I believe that something followed him here. Whoever swapped out his body didn't just do it for money or power. It's deeper than that." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. "This is ridiculous. He wasn't a spy or a criminal. He was just a man trying to protect his family. He loved us." "I believe you," Clara said, locking eyes with him. "But there's more to the story. Your father was trying to protect you, protect all of you." Claire looked down at the grave, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she whispered. "Everything's been turned upside down. Why would anyone do this to him? Why would anyone want to erase his existence?" Clara stepped forward, placing her hand on Claire's shoulder. Because whoever he was, he had enemies. Powerful ones. They all stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their uncertainty settling in. But it was clear that none of them could turn away from the truth, no matter how strange or terrifying it was. Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out Richard's watch again. She studied it carefully, holding it up to the light. The engraved words now seemed even more cryptic, but there was something she was missing. It had to mean something. Then, out of nowhere, a car pulled up to the cemetery gates. Clara's breath caught in her throat, and Samson's ears perked up. Someone was here, but it wasn't anyone they knew. The driver stepped out of the car, tall and serious, wearing a dark suit. His cold eyes scanned the scene quickly before his gaze landed on them. "Detective Dempsey," he called, his voice stern. "I believe we need to have a conversation." The stranger's presence sent a chill through the air, even though the sun was high in the sky. Clara could feel the weight of his gaze as he approached, his every movement calculated, like a man used to being in control. Samson's hackles were raised, and the low growl that rumbled in his chest was a clear warning. Clara's hand instinctively moved to her holster, even though she didn't want to make any sudden moves. Her instincts screamed that this man was not here by accident. He was wearing a dark suit, tailored perfectly, but there was something off about his appearance. The suit was immaculate, yet he carried himself like someone who'd been in much darker places. There was an aura of authority about him, an unspoken power, and Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. "Detective Dempsey," the man said again, his voice low and deliberate. His eyes scanned her, appraising her like she was a puzzle he'd yet to solve. "I'm Agent Harris. I work for an organization that has a vested interest in your investigation." Clara kept her distance, raising an eyebrow. "An organization? What exactly are you implying?" Harris glanced at the family members standing behind Clara, then back at her. Your father, Richard Holloway, he said, as if the name was a well-known secret, was involved in more than just financial dealings. He was a part of a network, an intelligence network. And he wasn't the man you thought he was. Claire's eyes widened, her expression a mix of confusion and disbelief. Ethan's face remained stoic, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, like he had already suspected something wasn't right. They had been trying to hold on to the image of their father as an ordinary man, a man who worked in finance, loved his family, and lived a simple life. But now it seemed that image was crumbling faster than they could rebuild it. You're saying my father wasn't just a businessman? Ethan asked, his voice a little too sharp. What exactly do you mean by intelligence network? Clara turned to look at Harris, feeling the weight of the questions on her shoulders. She had a feeling this man wasn't just some random government agent. He had a purpose, and it was clear he was here for a reason. The watch, the body swap, the forged death certificate, it was all adding up to something much bigger than she had anticipated. Harris didn't answer Ethan's question immediately. Instead, he shifted his gaze towards Samson, who was still watching him intently. There was something about the dog's unwavering attention that made Harris pause for a moment, as if he were considering something. Richard Holloway, Harris said finally, was a deep-cover operative. A spy, to put it bluntly. He infiltrated a dangerous organization, one that has been operating in the shadows for years. The words hung in the air like an unspoken truth. Clara felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Everything she had thought she knew about Richard Holloway was being called into question. Why did he fake his own death? Clara asked, her voice cracking. Why wouldn't he tell us the truth? Why was he? Harris held up a hand, silencing her gently. Your father's death wasn't meant to be a permanent goodbye. It was a cover, a necessary sacrifice. He had to disappear to protect you and everyone else around him. Clara felt a pang in her chest, a mixture of confusion and sorrow. If this was true, it meant Richard had been living a life filled with deception and danger, hiding from a world that would have destroyed him and his family if they knew the truth. Why come to us now? Clara asked, cutting through the tension. Why are you telling us this? Harris's eyes softened slightly, though there was no warmth in his gaze. Because Richard Holloway didn't just disappear. Someone took him. Someone who is still hunting him, and now they've started hunting you. The silence that followed his statement was deafening. Clara couldn't help but feel a knot tightening in her stomach. If this man was telling the truth, their lives were at risk. Richard Holloway was Blackbird, Harris said, his voice barely above a whisper, as though the name itself was too dangerous to speak aloud. And now, the people who wanted him dead are coming after anyone who was close to him. Clara's mind raced. Blackbird, Agent A. She had seen those words engraved on the back of Richard's watch. But now, hearing them from Harris's lips, the reality of it all hit her like a freight train. Who are these people? She asked, voice strained. What do they want? Harris looked down at his shoes for a moment, then back at her. They want to finish what they started. Richard Holloway was a threat to them. He knew too much. And now you're all in danger. It was the most ominous thing Clara had heard in a long time. Just then, a voice cut through the heavy silence. Who are you really? It was Claire, her eyes narrowing. She had finally found her voice, and the suspicion in her tone was unmistakable. She wasn't buying Harris's story just yet. Harris's gaze flickered for a moment, his lips pressing together in a thin line. Clara saw the fleeting hesitation, like he had almost said something more, something that would have made everything clearer. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. I'm someone who's trying to keep you alive, Harris said, the edges of his words sharp. But if you want to keep asking questions, I suggest you get out of here. Now, Samson growled lowly, his stance protective as he moved closer to Clara. The air seemed to crackle with an unspoken tension. Clara could feel the weight of Harris's gaze on her. His words were laced with urgency, but something about the way he was speaking made her uneasy. It wasn't just a simple government agency at play here. Harris was hiding something deeper than even he was willing to admit. With a final glance at the strange man standing in front of her, Clara spoke. We're not going anywhere, she said firmly. But we will need more answers. And I'll get them. One way or another. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Harris stood before them, silent for a moment, as if calculating his next move. His cold eyes never left Clara's, and she felt a rising unease settle in her stomach. Samson remained vigilant, still standing by Clara's side, his protective stance unwavering. Clara was used to deception, but this was something else. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but every new piece only created more questions. Richard Holloway was no ordinary man. He had lived a life that most could never imagine, and now his family was stuck in the crossfire of a dangerous world they didn't even know existed. Harris broke the silence, his voice now laced with a more urgent tone. The people who took your father have eyes everywhere. They'll be watching you, waiting for the right moment to strike. I suggest you be careful where you go and who you trust. Claire stepped forward, her hands trembling. Why should we trust you? What if you're just part of this whole mess? What if you're one of them? The accusation hung in the air, sharp and accusing. Harris didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step closer to the family, his expression unreadable. If I were one of them, I'd already be long gone, Harris replied. His words carried an air of finality. I'm here because I want to help you. And right now, that means making sure none of you end up like your father. Clara exchanged a glance with her siblings. This was the moment. They could either keep pushing Harris for answers, or they could trust him, even if it felt like stepping into a shadow they didn't fully understand. What do you want us to do? Clara asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion swirling within her. She had to remain composed if they were going to survive whatever was coming next. Harris's lips curled into a tight, almost grim smile. First, we need to get you all somewhere safe. I've arranged a place. After that, we'll start looking into who took your father. But trust me, this won't be easy. And time is against us. I'm not leaving, Claire protested, her voice firm. I'm not going anywhere until we know what happened to Richard. Harris's eyes softened for a moment, his gaze flickering with something that might have been empathy. But just as quickly, the hardness returned, and he glanced at the darkening sky. Then you'll make it harder on yourselves. The people who took your father don't wait. They'll be coming for you. Samson barked sharply, as if to agree with Harris, his tail wagging uncertainly. It was clear that the dog was alert, his senses sharper than anyone else's. Clara could feel the weight of his gaze, his instincts working overtime as he scanned the surroundings. Where do we go from here? Ethan asked, breaking the silence. His voice was still shaky, but there was determination behind it now. What do we do next? Clara looked at Harris, her eyes narrowing. She had to trust someone, even if she couldn't fully trust him. This whole situation was a whirlwind of lies and danger, but if she didn't act quickly, she might lose whatever chance she had of finding her father and keeping her family safe. Harris exhaled, a low sigh escaping his lips. I've set up a safe house for you all. I'll take you there tonight. After that, we'll need to move fast. The urgency in his voice told Clara that time was running out, and though she didn't fully understand all the pieces yet, she knew one thing. They couldn't stay here. Clara motioned for her family to gather their things. Samson trotted by her side, looking up at her, as if he knew the gravity of the situation. His fur seemed to bristle at the mention of danger, his ears flicking in all directions. He was more than just a dog now. He was their protector, and Clara would rely on him more than ever. We'll go with you, Clara said, her voice steady, even though her heart was pounding. She didn't know what this journey would bring, but there was no turning back now. Harris nodded, his lips tightening. Good. Keep close, and don't trust anyone. They'll be watching. As they moved toward the car, Clara's mind raced with thoughts of her father. What had happened to him? Who had taken him, and why? The more she thought about it, the more questions surfaced. This wasn't just a family tragedy. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The drive to the safe house was quiet. Ethan had his arms crossed, staring out the window, while Claire sat beside him, her face pale. Samson lay at their feet, his ears perked, always alert. The weight of the situation hung heavy, and none of them spoke, but Clara could feel the fear in the air, palpable and suffocating. After what felt like hours, they finally arrived at a small, secluded cabin on the edge of town. It was a place no one would think to look, hidden away in a forest of tall trees. Harris opened the door, ushering them inside quickly. The cabin was modest, with only the essentials, a few chairs, a table, and a small fireplace. But it was safe, at least for now. Stay here, Harris instructed. I'll be in touch. I need to dig deeper into your father's past and find out who's behind this. Clara nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. We need answers, Harris. We need to know what happened. Harris's gaze softened again, but it was fleeting. You'll get them. But the truth is dangerous. And there's more at play here than you can imagine. With that, he left them alone, disappearing into the night. The door shut with a soft click, and the room seemed to grow quieter, darker. As Clara settled into a chair, Samson curled up beside her, his warm body a small comfort in the midst of so much uncertainty. She reached down to pet him, feeling his calmness seep into her own tense muscles. The dog was her only connection to the reality of the world they just entered. Whatever came next, she knew she wasn't facing it alone. The night stretched on, but Clara couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin seemed magnified. Every shadow outside felt like it was hiding something, someone. She sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers absently stroking Samson's fur, his presence the only thing grounding her in a world that felt increasingly foreign. Her thoughts kept circling back to her father. Richard Holloway had always been a quiet man, reserved but steady. She had never imagined his life could have been anything but ordinary. But now, with every piece of information they uncovered, the mystery deepened. Richard had been living a double life, one she could have never predicted. The coffin, the stranger, the forged death certificate. What had he been involved in? Dad, what did you get yourself into? She whispered to the darkened room. Samson lifted his head at the sound of her voice, his golden eyes locking with hers. He didn't need words to understand her distress. His soft whine was enough. Clara leaned down, resting her forehead against his. The cabin was eerily silent, save for the occasional sound of the wind rustling the leaves outside. It felt like the calm before a storm, an unsettling stillness that only served to heighten her anxiety. She knew the danger wasn't over. Harris had warned them, but that was no longer her biggest fear. The unanswered questions were. A soft knock on the door shattered the quiet, and Clara's heart leapt into her throat. She glanced at Samson, who immediately stood, his muscles tense. Who is it? Clara called out, her voice steady but her heart pounding in her chest. It's me. Harris. Clara breathed a sigh of relief, though she remained cautious. They couldn't afford to trust anyone too easily. She stood up and crossed to the door, glancing at the others. Ethan and Claire were both still awake, sitting across the room, eyes wide with uncertainty. They had been through so much already, and Clara could see the strain on their faces. Stay here, she whispered to them before opening the door. Harris stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light outside. He looked over his shoulder before stepping inside, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something darker. I found something, he said, his voice low. Clara's pulse quickened. What is it? Harris pulled out a small folder from under his coat. It's your father's, Richard's file. It's not what you think. And it's not just about him. He handed the folder to Clara, who took it with trembling hands. She opened it cautiously, the contents revealing cryptic notes, images, and a series of reports that made her heart race. This is ridiculous, Clara murmured, scanning the papers. There were photographs of Richard Holloway with unfamiliar people, men in suits, faces partially obscured, but the most chilling were the notes written in the margins. Agent X, Operation Overlook, Safe House Location, 14-3. What is this? Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Harris stepped closer. Your father wasn't just some ordinary man. He was part of something much bigger, something that goes back further than I can explain. Richard Holloway was a secret agent. He went by the code name Agent X. Clara froze. Her father, a secret agent? It was impossible. But the documents in her hand, documents that didn't lie, spoke a truth that she didn't want to accept. Why didn't we know? Claire's voice was shaky, her eyes wide with disbelief. Harris shook his head, a grim expression on his face. Your father was protecting you. His job was dangerous, and he never wanted you to know about it. He kept his life, his real life, away from all of you. He wanted to shield you from this world, but now, Harris trailed off, glancing over at the window as if something out there was watching. The room fell into a stunned silence as Clara processed the revelation. She had never imagined this life for her father. He had always seemed so ordinary, so unassuming. The idea that he had been living under a false identity, had perhaps even faked his own death, felt like a betrayal. Where is he now? Ethan's voice cracked as he stood up from his seat, eyes full of desperation. If he's alive, we need to find him. Harris nodded grimly. That's what we're going to do. But it's going to take time, and it's going to take us into places that are darker than you can imagine. Clara's mind spun with questions. How had they gotten Richard's body? Why had they taken him? And most importantly, who was behind it all? Before she could voice any of her thoughts, there was a loud thump outside the cabin, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone or something moving through the trees. Get down, Harris hissed, pulling Clara back as he instinctively moved to the window. The sound grew louder. Something or someone was getting closer. Samson growled lowly, his body tense, eyes narrowed. He didn't need to be told twice. With a series of soft barks, he leapt toward the door, his hackles raised. Harris turned to Clara with a look of grim determination. Stay here. Don't make a sound. He opened the door just a crack, peering out into the shadows. The night was still, but the tension in the air had thickened. Clara could feel her heartbeat in her throat as the distant sounds of footsteps grew closer. Stay quiet, Harris warned again, his eyes scanning the surroundings. He stepped outside, motioning for Samson to follow. The minutes that passed felt like hours. Clara, Ethan, and Claire remained huddled in the cabin, holding their breath. Every creak of the floorboards felt amplified, every whisper of wind outside unnerving. And then, out of the corner of her eye, Clara saw something. A flicker of movement near the tree line. Someone or something was out there, watching them. Harris had disappeared into the night, but Clara wasn't sure whether that was a good thing. She wasn't sure if they were safe anymore. And she wasn't sure who could be trusted. The air inside the cabin was thick with tension. Clara could feel her heart beating in her chest, faster than ever, as she sat still, barely daring to breathe. Claire and Ethan were beside her, both as tense as she was, eyes flicking nervously toward the door, waiting for Harris to return. They had no idea what was waiting for them outside, and the uncertainty felt like a weight pressing down on them all. Samson, the ever-loyal dog, had settled at Clara's feet, but his alert posture, his ears pricked, his nose twitching, was a constant reminder that danger could strike at any moment. The dog's instincts were sharp, but Clara couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. She had been the one to bring Samson along, and now, it seemed, the dog was the only one keeping them grounded in this spiraling nightmare. Minutes dragged by. Clara's thoughts were racing, trying to make sense of everything she had learned about her father. Richard Holloway, secret agent. The man she had known her whole life, her quiet, humble father, had been leading a double life. And the body in the coffin. It wasn't his. But why? What had happened to him? And why had they gone so far as to fake his death? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft thump from outside, followed by a low growl from Samson. Clara stiffened. It was the same sound she had heard just before Harris had left. The sound of movement outside the cabin. The footsteps were closer now, deliberate, careful. She exchanged a glance with Ethan. Do you think it's Harris? He whispered, his voice tight with anxiety. Clara didn't answer immediately. Her mind was racing, trying to piece together the puzzle. If Harris had been outside for this long, why hadn't he returned? Had he been compromised? Or had he found something? Samson was the first to react. He stood up, his growl low and steady, a clear sign that he sensed something or someone was near. The air around them seemed to grow colder, the night heavier. Clara could feel it too, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the hairs on her arms standing on end. A loud knock echoed through the cabin door. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Before she could make a move, the door slowly creaked open, and Harris stepped inside, his face grim, eyes scanning the room quickly. His clothes were disheveled, his hair matted from the wind. He closed the door behind him, locking it with a click. They're coming, Harris said, his voice low and urgent. We don't have much time. Clara shot to her feet, her breath catching. Who? What's going on out there? Harris didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved toward the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peer outside. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the shadows beyond. I don't know, he said, his voice tight with frustration. But I do know one thing, we're not safe here anymore. Not for long. Clara felt her stomach drop. She had suspected as much. The situation had already spiraled so far out of control that she was no longer sure who they could trust. Harris had been their guide, their protector, but now he seemed just as uncertain as they were. What do we do now? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harris's eyes met Clara's. We leave. No. I've got a safe house, one that isn't compromised. We'll head there, regroup, and figure out our next move. Clara nodded, but a question burned in the back of her mind. What about my father? What about Richard? Is he still out there? Is he still alive? The question hung in the air, unanswered. But Harris's eyes betrayed something, a flicker of doubt, of something darker. We'll find him, he said, but his voice lacked the confidence Clara had hoped for. A loud crash outside shattered the tension, followed by shouting voices. Clara's blood ran cold. They didn't have much time. Harris turned, pulling his jacket tighter around him. Get ready, he ordered. We're moving out. The urgency in his voice left no room for hesitation. Samson let out another low growl, his body stiffening as he moved to the door, his protective instincts taking over. Clara felt a rush of determination, mixed with fear. She had to stay focused. For her father, for her family, and for herself. Ethan moved toward the back of the cabin, his eyes wide as he glanced around the room. Claire followed him, her face pale but resolute. Samson darted past them, heading toward the door. Harris opened the door just a crack, peering out into the night. The tension in the air was palpable, and Clara's pulse quickened. We're going out the back, Harris said, his voice low. Stay close, and don't make a sound. The group moved silently, stepping carefully through the shadows, avoiding the open clearing that led to the front of the cabin. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves felt like a threat. Clara's mind was racing, replaying everything they had learned. Her father, an agent. The strange man in the coffin. The disappearance. The forged death certificate. And now someone was looking for them. Someone who wanted them silenced. The group moved swiftly through the woods, following Harris's lead. Samson remained close by Clara's side, his presence the small comfort in the growing darkness. It wasn't long before they reached the safe house. A small, nondescript cabin hidden deep in the woods. It looked abandoned, but Clara could tell it was well secured. Harris checked the area, his sharp eyes scanning every corner before leading them inside. As they settled into the dimly lit room, Harris turned to face them all. This is only the beginning, he said. They know we're here. They know we've been investigating Richard's death. And they're not going to stop until they get what they want. Clara's heart sank. She had thought they were just chasing ghosts, but now she realized just how deep the conspiracy ran. Her father's life had been a lie, and now they were all in the middle of something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Who are they, Harris? Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Harris hesitated for a moment before answering, his gaze heavy. They're part of a covert organization, one that's been operating under the radar for years. And your father was involved in taking them down. Clara felt her world tilt. Her father, the quiet man she thought she knew, had been fighting a secret war. And now it was all coming to light. Get some rest, Harris said, his voice gruff. We'll figure this out. But we're in it now. No turning back. Clara sank into a chair, her mind racing. She couldn't turn back. But she wasn't sure what she was walking into. What had her father been involved in? And why had he faked his own death? The questions would have to wait. For now, survival was the only thing that mattered. The morning light filtered through the small cabin's windows, casting pale beams across the worn floorboards. Clara woke with a start, the events of the night before still fresh in her mind. Her heart raced as she realized the weight of what they were up against. The quiet life she had known, the life her father had created for her, seemed like a distant memory. Now everything was uncertain, and the danger lurking outside felt closer than ever. She sat up in a chair, the room still dim, only a faint glow of daylight seeping through the cracks in the wood. Ethan and Claire were still asleep, their exhaustion evident from the long hours of travel and fear. Samson lay by Clara's feet, his eyes half closed. But even in sleep, he remained alert, ever watchful. It was as if the dog knew that even the briefest moment of relaxation could mean disaster. Clara's mind spun, circling back to what Harris had said. Her father, Richard Holloway, had been fighting a war in the shadows, a war against an organization she knew nothing about. A secret war. The man she had known as her father was someone entirely different, an agent, an operative, a player in a larger game. But why had he faked his own death? Why hadn't he trusted her? Why had he left her in the dark all these years? The silence in the cabin was oppressive. She rose from the chair, pacing across the room, her thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. Harris had said the people after them would stop at nothing to silence them. But what exactly did they want? What had Richard been involved in? As if answering her unspoken question, the sound of footsteps outside the cabin reached Clara's ears. They were deliberate and heavy, as though someone was walking toward the door. Her heart skipped a beat, and she glanced quickly toward the others. Ethan stirred, rubbing his eyes, and Claire blinked awake, still groggy from the night's exhaustion. "Stay quiet," Clara whispered, her voice tense with urgency. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Clara's pulse quickened. Her mind raced. Was it someone from the organization? Had they already found them? Samson growled low and steady, his hackles raised. His instincts were sharp, and Clara knew better than to ignore them. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the door. Clara's breath hitched. Who could it be? Harris was the first to react, moving swiftly to the window. He crouched down, peering through the slats, his face hardening as he recognized the figure outside. Clara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Harris's expression was unreadable as he slowly stood up and made his way to the door. "It's a friend," Harris said quietly, though his voice betrayed the tension beneath his calm exterior. Before Clara could respond, Harris opened the door, revealing a man dressed in dark clothes, his face covered by a hood. The stranger's eyes locked onto Clara's, and for a split second, she felt a chill run down her spine. "This is Mason," Harris introduced him, his tone guarded. "He's the one I've been telling you about." Mason, the stranger, nodded curtly. His face remained partially obscured, but his sharp eyes seemed to take in everything around him in a single glance. Clara's instincts screamed at her to be cautious, but Harris's trust in the man made her hesitate. "Mason's one of the few people who's been tracking the organization," Harris continued. "He can help us." Clara nodded slowly, though her mind was still racing with questions. The man's presence felt heavy in the room, as if the very air had shifted. "What exactly is going on, Harris?" Clara asked, her voice strained. "Who are these people? Why did my father fake his own death?" Harris exchanged a long look with Mason, who stepped inside the cabin, his presence making the room feel even smaller. He didn't answer immediately, instead pulling out a worn envelope from the jacket pocket. He handed it to Clara without a word. Clara took it hesitantly, her hands trembling as she opened the envelope. Inside, there was a single photograph. It was a grainy image of her father, Richard Holloway, standing with a group of unfamiliar faces in front of a nondescript building. The photo had clearly been taken years ago. The people around Richard looked tense, too tense for a simple photograph. "What is this?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your father was involved in an operation, an undercover mission," Mason said, his voice low and steady. "He was part of a covert unit that worked to infiltrate this organization. But things went wrong." Clara's head spun. "What happened?" Mason's gaze darkened. "Your father's cover was blown. He was targeted. And to keep you safe, he faked his death. He thought it was the only way to protect you." Clara felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. Everything she had known about her father, about her life, seemed to be slipping away, replaced by a truth she wasn't prepared for. Her father, the quiet, unassuming man she had always known, had been leading a double life. And now, it seemed, she was entangled in a web of secrets that could cost her everything. "Where is he now?" Clara demanded. "Why didn't he contact me? Why didn't he trust me enough to tell me the truth?" Mason's eyes softened, but only for a moment. "We don't know where he is. We think he's still alive, but we can't be sure. The organization has agents everywhere. They have resources, influence. If they found out you were asking questions about your father, they'd come after you too." Clara's mind raced as she processed the information. Her father wasn't just missing, he had been involved in something far bigger than her. And now she was standing on the precipice of something she couldn't fully comprehend. Harris stepped forward, his face serious. "We can't stay here much longer. They'll be looking for us, and if they think we know anything about Richard's disappearance, we'll be targets too." Clara felt the weight of his words sink in. They weren't just investigating her father's death anymore. They were running for their lives. "We need to find him," Clara said, her voice steely with determination. I need to know the truth. Mason nodded, his expression grave. We will. But we need to be careful. They've been watching for a long time. The only way we're going to find your father is to stay one step ahead. Clara took a deep breath, the fear in her chest rising, but she refused to let it consume her. She had to push forward. Her father needed her. And no matter the danger, she wasn't going to stop until she had answers. As the group gathered their things and prepared to leave the cabin, Samson rose from his spot, his eyes sharp, ears perked. Clara looked down at him. The dog had been her father's loyal companion, and now in this strange new world of secrets and danger, he was more than just a pet, he was a protector. The time for questions was over. It was time to find Richard Holloway. And nothing, not even the dangers lurking in the shadows, would stop Clara from discovering the truth. Days passed since Clara, Mason, and Harris had fled the cabin, traveling from one remote location to another, always on the move. The landscape outside their car windows had become a blur of forests, mountains, and cities, each place only a temporary refuge. Every new town was a chance to breathe, but also a reminder that the threat was never far behind. Samson, ever watchful, never let his guard down, his instincts as sharp as ever. He stayed close to Clara, sensing the undercurrent of tension that ran through her, the weight of uncertainty on her shoulders. The dog, her constant companion, had become her tether to something familiar in a world now spinning with secrets. Clara's mind remained preoccupied with the photograph Mason had given her. It had shown her father, Richard Holloway, standing with unknown figures, all looking over their shoulders as if the shadows were closing in on them. The faces had been unfamiliar, but Clara knew one thing for sure: her father had been surrounded by enemies. But the question remained, what had he been doing? What had gone wrong? And who had betrayed him? One night, after they had set up camp in an abandoned cabin tucked away in the woods, Clara sat by the fire, her thoughts swirling. The flames crackled and popped, casting a warm glow that failed to ease the chill creeping into her bones. Ethan sat beside her, staring into the fire, lost in his own thoughts. The tension between them had become palpable since they had started this journey. Ethan was afraid, and Clara couldn't blame him. They were all afraid. But the weight of her father's secrets pressed hardest on her. She felt Mason's gaze before she heard him approach. He stood a few feet away, observing her, his face unreadable in the darkness. She knew he had been talking to Harris, but there was something he hadn't told her. She could feel it in the way he watched her. The silence between them grew longer, a barrier neither of them could cross. Finally, Mason broke the quiet. We need to talk. Clara met his gaze, her eyes narrowing. About what? Mason hesitated before stepping closer. He looked around as if ensuring they were truly alone, before lowering his voice. It's about your father. Clara's heart raced. What about him? Mason sat down beside her, but he didn't meet her eyes. We found something. Something that could change everything. Clara's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Mason reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thin file. He handed it to her wordlessly. Clara took it, fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside, there were more photographs, clear this time, of her father. Richard Holloway, but this time in different locations, different times. And in each image, there was one constant, a man always lurking in the background. A man with cold, calculating eyes. The file contained a series of documents as well, names, dates, locations, and a letter. Clara unfolded it, her hand shaking as she read the words written in her father's handwriting. Clara, if you're reading this, then I have failed you. They've found me, and I fear they've already compromised everything. I have no choice but to disappear. I need you to know the truth, but it's too dangerous for me to tell you now. Find Mason. Trust him. He's the only one who can protect you. And above all, trust Samson. He's been with me every step of the way. You may not understand everything yet, but you will. Clara felt the sting of tears in her eyes. Her father had known all along. He had been preparing for this moment, the moment she would be forced to learn the truth. He had known she would be caught in the crossfire of his war, and he had given her one final warning, one final command. Mason's voice interrupted her thoughts. The man in the photos is named Gregory Blackwood. He's the one your father was working against. And he's the one who has been pulling the strings all along. Clara's breath caught in her throat. What do you mean? Mason leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Blackwood isn't just some criminal. He's the leader of a covert organization, one that has infiltrated governments, corporations, everything. Your father was part of a team trying to take him down. But something went wrong. Blackwood found out, and he did everything he could to silence your father. Clara's mind reeled. Her father had been a secret agent, but this was bigger than she could have ever imagined. The stakes were higher than life and death. They were a matter of national security. So what now? Clara asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. How do we stop him? Mason looked away, his eyes darkened by the weight of the answer. We don't. Not without more help. But I know someone who can help us get closer to Blackwood. Clara stood up, feeling the rush of urgency flood her veins. Ooh, I'll take you to them, Mason said, his face grim. But we have to leave now. Before Clara could respond, the sound of Samson's low growl cut through the air. The dog stood at the edge of the firelight, his body tense. His eyes, wide and alert, scanned the dark woods. Mason, Harris, and Clara froze. Something's wrong, Clara whispered. The tension in the air thickened, and as the wind whispered through the trees, Clara's heart sank. The moment they had feared had arrived. They weren't alone anymore. The air grew colder as Clara, Mason, Harris, and Samson stood motionless, each aware of the danger creeping closer. The wind whistled through the trees like a ghostly whisper. The only sound in the night as Samson's growl deepened. The dog's instincts were sharp, his hackles raised. Something was out there. Get to the car, Mason commanded quietly, his voice low and urgent. We need to leave. Now. Clara's heart was pounding in her chest as she exchanged a look with Ethan. She knew they couldn't stay. They had already attracted too much attention. The closer they came to the truth, the more dangerous it became. But who was out there, lurking in the dark? And how much closer was Gregory Blackwood's organization? Samson, stay close, Clara whispered to the dog, her voice steady despite the panic rising inside her. The dog's ears perked up, his body coiled in readiness. They made their way to the car as quickly as possible, moving like shadows through the trees, but there was no escaping the feeling of being watched. Every crackling leaf, every rustling branch felt like a threat, a sign that they were being hunted. The hair on the back of Clara's neck stood on end. As they piled into the car, the engine roared to life. Clara slammed the door shut, the heavy thud of it echoing in the quiet woods. Mason looked out the rearview mirror, his face grim. They're closing in, he muttered. We don't have much time. Harris gunned the engine, the car skidding over the dirt road. They swerved around tight turns, the headlights slicing through the night. The woods were thick, the trees like silent sentinels watching them flee. Where are we going? Clara asked, her voice tight with fear. To someone who can help, Mason replied. But it's risky. We're going to have to trust them. Clara's heart ached with uncertainty. Who could they trust now? Their entire world had been built on lies, betrayals, and secrets. The path ahead was shrouded in shadows, but one thing was clear. There was no turning back. They reached an old, abandoned building on the outskirts of town. The place looked dilapidated, its windows dark and cracked, but it was clear that someone was expecting them. The moment they stepped out of the car, a tall, thin figure emerged from the shadows. Clara's pulse quickened as she recognized him. It was Richard Holloway's old contact. Are you sure you trust him? Ethan whispered, his voice laced with doubt. Mason nodded. We don't have a choice. The man stepped forward, offering no greeting. His eyes locked with Mason's, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Then he turned his gaze to Clara, his expression unreadable. Come inside, he said curtly. We don't have much time. They followed him into the building, the air inside cold and musty. It was clear that whatever this place was, it had seen better days. The walls were lined with old computers and files, some of them disheveled, others meticulously organized. It was a secret base, one that had likely been used by Richard Holloway and others like him in the past. Now, explain, the man demanded once they were all seated around a table. Mason didn't waste time. Blackwood. We need everything you have on him. He's the one who's been behind everything. He's the one who orchestrated Richard's death, or at least the fake one. The man's eyes narrowed. I suspected as much, but I didn't know you'd get this close to the truth. Clara's heart raced as the man opened a file. He slid it across the table toward her. "This is what you need," he said. "Everything we've collected on Blackwood, his operations, his network. Your father, he was deeply involved in this. He was working to take Blackwood down from the inside." Clara's hands trembled as she opened the file. Inside were documents, photos, and cryptic notes. And in one of the photos, Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was a picture of Richard, alive. He was standing beside a man Clara had never seen before, a man whose cold eyes mirrored the same menace she had seen in Blackwood's photo. The truth hit Clara like a wave. Her father wasn't dead. He had faked his own death to escape the reach of Blackwood. Her world spun as everything began to click into place. He didn't die. He went underground. Clara's voice trembled as she looked up at Mason. "My father was working against Blackwood all along. He didn't betray us. He was trying to protect us." The man nodded gravely. "Exactly. But Blackwood is a dangerous man. He's been pulling the strings for years. And now that you know the truth, they'll come for you." A cold chill ran down Clara's spine as she looked at the files, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. The group left the building, the weight of the truth heavy on their shoulders. They knew what they had to do now. It wasn't just about finding Richard anymore. It was about stopping Blackwood once and for all. With the new information they had, they traced Blackwood's operations to a secluded facility outside the city. Clara's heart raced with anticipation, her mind focused on one thing: finding her father and ending Blackwood's reign of terror. The team made their way toward the facility, their plans set in motion. But as they approached the gates, a harsh voice broke through the silence. "You really thought you could stop me?" Blackwood stepped out from the shadows, flanked by his men. His cold eyes locked onto Clara's, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. "We've been playing this game for far too long," Blackwood sneered. "But you've come too far now. You're too dangerous." Clara felt the weight of the moment settle on her. This was it. There would be no going back. With a look to Mason, Harris, and Samson, they moved in, preparing for the final showdown. The battle was fierce, but in the end, it was Samson who took the final action. With a single leap, he knocked Blackwood to the ground, his sharp teeth sinking into the man's arm, incapacitating him. With Blackwood restrained, Clara turned to Mason. "Where's my father?" she demanded. Mason smiled grimly. "He's safe. He's been working with us the entire time." As the dust settled, Clara stood over Blackwood, her breath ragged with exhaustion. It was over. Blackwood's organization had been exposed, his power shattered. And as promised, Richard Holloway was alive. Clara's father, battered but unbroken, stepped forward from the shadows. His familiar face, though older, was still the same. He embraced Clara, and for the first time in years, she felt the weight of the truth settle on her shoulders. "Dad, you're here," Clara whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I had to protect you. All of you." Together, with Mason, Harris, and Samson by their side, they had brought down Blackwood, uncovered the conspiracy, and reclaimed their future. The Holloway family's secrets were no longer hidden in the shadows. The world they had known had changed, but for Clara, one thing was certain: the truth had finally come to light. And now nothing could stand in their way.